idea of autonomous action, when you apply the mind and express your intellect and put it on text, has something to do with Amy Gutman's idea, which she argues for in the book Identity and Democracy, published in 2003. That particular book, where Gutman actually brings the idea of shaping identity through democracy and vice versa. And she raises a very poignant point in the book where the exercise of your freedom of expression, if you want to say that your freedom has to be autonomous and unconstrained, she alerts us to the point that freedom cannot be unconstrained. In other words, can I say what I want to say? Of course not. Because if you say what you want to say and it does an injustice to somebody else, it has to be constrained. And what she brings to liberal democratic education discourses is the idea of a freedom of exertion that can actually be constrained, that you can actually put a limit on freedom of exertion. So if Gerd Wilders, for instance, wants to show and ridicule, for example, a primary source of Islamic education by pointing out, quite erroneously, I might add as well, how verses of the Quran are in fact encouraging a form of violent antagonism towards the other. That is a form of injustice towards the other if the other is not permitted a defense of that particular point of view. So my contention here is that that kind of freedom of expression, which can have catastrophic and devastating effects for society, because otherwise we don't grow communities, should be restrained and constrained. And my understanding of intellectual exertion is not that you are limited in terms of research for regimes of truths, because there cannot be a single truth. That would be, if one argues for a single absolute truth, that would be a denial of other truths which actually exist, and that brings you into conflict with many different views as well. And as soon as you go to make an argument for a monolithic absolute understanding of a particular point of view, it might get you into conflict with other views that you might find abhorrent or resentful. So instead of arguing for a specific truth, I would rather argue for what Michel Foucault would call regimes of truths. And this idea of constraining expression, which would allow for autonomous exertion of the mind, but with some limitation to it. But that kind of limitation has to be negotiated as well. That seems to be an idea of a liberal conception of democratic citizenship education, which finds resonance with an Islamic concept of ijtihad, intellectual exertion. The second point is about this maximalist view of shura, which I call, in Sheila bin Abid's terms, democratic iterations. But you have to learn to talk back, but after you have learned, but first you have to listen to the various views of others, because you cannot talk back if you don't have an informed understanding of the views of others. So listening willingly, as well as talking back and doing that over and over again, is a form of democratic iteration which finds resonance with the idea of public deliberation in the same vein as I've articulated the notion of shura, the maximalist form of public deliberation. And for me, this is the key. Public deliberation also suggests that there cannot be absolute finality about points of view, because points of view will have to be taken into critical scrutiny by others. They have to be deliberated on, and that particular idea was very common in the practices of the jurists of the Islamic past. It is only in the medieval ages that this door for intellectual exertion within the Islamic discourses was slightly closed, not completely, but more because of, I would say, political context, and which shaped that kind of autonomous action and embedded autonomous action into the hands of a few jurists in the Islamic discourse. So what I'm saying, I do not actually believe that the doors for intellectual exertion were ever closed in Islam. They were always left open, but there was a degree of political manipulation and control which contributed towards the bias we have in relation to some texts and interpretations of texts. We still have it today. In the Muslim and Arab world, it's very common to ban particular translations of the primary source of Islamic education, not to consider some translations of the Quran as pertinent or defensible or legitimate enough, and I think that is wrong. Interpretations will remain interpretations, and that will give you a particular, will advocate a particular view of the type of education in a particular way. So if you can produce, as the Quran itself demands you, if you can produce a different chapter or a different sentence, you have to do it. And that to me suggests that there should be a constant process of iteration, of learning to listen and learning to give a different point of view and learning to talk back. And this idea of learning to talk back is not at variance with an Islamic concept of education at all. As I've done, I've shown that recognition of the other is very much salient to Islamic education. And what I'm doing here is to use Martin Nussbaum's concept of compassionate imagining, which is published in the book Upheavals of Thought, The Intelligence of Emotions, quite a brilliant text. And I use Derrida's idea of hospitality. First, compassionate imagining. Why I say the idea of compassionate imagining is not out of tune with recognition of the other. Because compassionate imagining is about recognizing the vulnerabilities within others and actually doing something about the situation, actually to change it. And often, if I just look conceptually at the entire structure of the primary source of Islamic education, every verse of the Quran begins with the opening in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Compassion is in every verse of the Quran, every opening sentence, except in the 9th chapter where compassion is mentioned within the text itself and not the opening. And that suggests to me that the Quran is quite insistent that compassionate imagining should be a goal of a human being's life, to recognize vulnerabilities within others and actually doing something about changing it. And there are many practices of Muslims and Muslim organizations